Welcome everyone. Today we're going to get into the animation portion of 3D art and animation. So we're finally going to learn, rather than just making static images, we're finally going to learn how to make the objects in our scene move and create some little videos. There's a couple of vocab things that we need to get out of the way first, though. A big one being when we talk about animations, traditionally, an animation is a bunch of still images put together to look like something is moving. So images that are played very rapidly, one right after another, to simulate motion. Each of these images we call a frame. For those of you who are avid gamers or video editors or have some experience with movie making, you've probably heard the term frames per second. And that just simply means how many images or how many shots make up a single second in an animation. In traditional animation, we would have to draw every one of those frames ourselves. Luckily, we don't have to do that with Blender. Blender provides a process through which we are able to specify certain frames and then it fills in the rest. So for this, we are actually going to need a different layout. For the first time, we're going to move from our default layout up here at the top of the screen, and I'm going to change this to animation. And in the animation layout, we're going to see a couple of new windows that we're going to deal with. And the reason that I want to have these windows open is because it allows us to see where I've placed frames. And we're going to talk about how we place frames in a second. So you can see that I still have my 3D window here. I still have my outliner and my properties window. I still have my timeline. But we've added two new panels. This guy is called the dope sheet. And the dope sheet is going to show us where our frames are. And this is the graph editor. The graph editor shows us changes in movement in a particular object. So let's talk about frames. In the case of the animations we make, we're going to make animations that are either 30 frames per second or maybe 24 frames per second. However, we're not going to create 30 different frames for every single second. All we have to do is create what's called a keyframe. A keyframe is the frame where the movement ends. Basically, if I want to, let's say, move my cube from here to here, that's going to be my animation. Really simple. Rather than creating a frame every few seconds of movement, every little bit, rather than do that, all I have to do is create a keyframe at my starting point and create a keyframe at my ending point. And Blender fills in the rest of the animation. So the only time we have to make a keyframe is if the movement changes. If I wanted the cube to go from the center to the left and then forward, I'd have to make 3 keyframes. One at the beginning, one at the second position, and one at the third position. So anytime you want your motion to change, that's when we need a keyframe. So let's talk about how to make a keyframe. First, and this is most important, a lot of people forget this, always make a starting keyframe. A lot of people will just start moving their object, and then there isn't any place for the animation to start from. So we have to make sure that if this is where my cube begins, I need a keyframe here. And I'm going to do that with a new shortcut. I inserts a keyframe. So let's go for it. Now there's something interesting about this. When I click I, it gives me a bunch of options for how I want to insert a keyframe. Keyframing can be done on any property of an object, but it has to be the property that we're modifying. In this example, I want my cube to move, so I'm changing my cube's location. So I'm going to set a location keyframe. And now let's take a look at our dope sheet. In our dope sheet, we can see that there's this little diamond now. This diamond means that at frame 1 in our animation, there is a keyframe inserted. So this cube has a starting position. And we can see that the keyframe is a location keyframe. So we know that the cube is going to be moving. I could have set rotation if I wanted the cube to spin, or I could have set scale if I want the cube to grow. Basically, whatever I want to change about the cube, that's what I need to set my keyframe on. So now we need to do two things. First, we make a starting keyframe, then we move to a new frame, change the object, and set a new keyframe. I'm going to number these guys because these are our steps. And we're always going to want to follow the steps in this order. The most common thing that students forget, other than not setting a starting keyframe, is to change the time. So we need to figure out how long it's going to take for our cube to move. All the way down here on our timeline, we have three very important values. The first value is a single, is the start frame of our animation. So we start at frame 1. That's pretty typical. No reason to change that. End frame, right here, controls how far or how long our animation is. So right now our animation is 250 frames. And then we talk about which frame we're on currently. So if I'm doing a 30 frames per second and we were to look at our timeline, that means that my first second of animation would end right here on the 30. My second would end at 60 and then 90 and so on. We are going to have this cube take 1 second to get where it needs to go. So I need to jump to frame 30. This little guy, this little selection next to my start and end frames is the current frame. So right now, I'm on frame 1. I'm going to go here and jump to frame 30. Now, nothing happened with my cube because I haven't placed a keyframe yet. Now that I'm 1 second into my animation, I know that after 1 second, my cube should be here. Oh, actually here. I turned myself around. So now I've moved my cube to where I want it to be. I press I to insert another keyframe, and I changed its location, so I select location. And a couple of things happened. The first thing that happened is that on our dope sheet, at frame 30, notice here, showing us what our current frame is, there is another set of keyframes. This keyframe happens to be a location keyframe on the cube object. We also see that our graph editor changes. The graph editor shows the modification to the cube's location. The location started at 0 and then began to increase on the y-axis. So this graph allows us to manipulate how rapidly the movement happens. It also allows us to change the, change the shape of my movement. So I could kind of, by using these handles, I can modify how smooth the animation is, if there's any pauses. So like by doing this, it looks like the cube's going to go farther than it needs to and then settle back down again. I'm going to undo that. But there's a whole manner of ways that we can use the graph editor to modify our animations, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Now, if I jump to different frames, so let's say I go to frame 15, notice that even though I haven't placed a keyframe at frame 15, Blender has begun calculating what needs to happen between frame 1 and frame 30. So now I can go to any frame between those, let's say frame 25, and my cube is almost at the end of its animation. So Blender automatically adds those for us. Now, the most common, I'm going to go back to frame 1 to our starting point. The most common things we're going to be animating on are location, rotation, and scale. But we can actually make keyframes on any property of an object. We can animate pretty much everything about our object if we want to. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. How do we preview our animation, though? We've done our animation. How do we check it out? So there's a couple of ways. The first way is to press the little play button down here on our timeline. But notice that the tooltip also tells us that we can use Alt plus A. And Alt A previews an animation. So I'm going to do Alt A, and we can see that in the first second of our animation, our cube slides to the right and doesn't do a whole lot else because we haven't added any more keyframes. So let's add another one. I'm going to demonstrate how we get this cube to use a different type of keyframe. I'm going to make a rotation keyframe. So remember, looking at our steps here, step number 1, always make a starting keyframe. So if my cube slides all the way to the right, and now I want it to rotate, I need to make a keyframe to show that it starts here. So I'm going to do I, and then insert a rotation keyframe. And now we can see that on our dope sheet, now at frame 30, there exists keyframes for both location and rotation. So now that I have a keyframe for rotation, I'm going to take another, let's say, second. So I'm going to go up to frame 60. I'm going to jump another second into our animation. I'm going to rotate my cube a little bit and insert another rotation keyframe. And now notice that there's no location keyframe here. There's only one for rotation because that's all I'm changing. So I only need to insert keyframes for the aspects that I change. And now if I go back to the beginning and preview my animation, we should see that it slides and then it rotates. So finally, let's have a little bit of fun with this. And at frame 60, I want this thing to start growing. So to make it grow, I'm going to insert a scaling keyframe. So it's going to start here, and now in my dope sheet, I have a keyframe for scale, and they've also added a line for scale. I am going to then take another second, so I'm going to jump to frame 90, and I'm going to use my scale tool to make the cube bigger. And I'm going to use I to insert a scaling keyframe. So now my cube should do 3 things. It should move from here to here, and then rotate from here to here, and then scale from here to here. Let's check it out. Rotates, and it grows. Good, so our animation is working. Now, the big question is, how do we get the animation to render? So rendering is pretty simple for images, right? We just do F12, or we go to render image, and then we save the image. Saving it as a video involves a little bit more. So if we look at our properties and we look at our button bar, there is a spot on our button bar that looks like a little digital camera. That digital camera is our render settings. So I'm going to make another little entry here for render settings. And the render settings let us specify a bunch of stuff about our animation. But the most important one, or a couple of really important ones, is it allows us to determine our frame rate right here. So you see it's set to 24 by default. I'm going to go ahead and change that to 30. 30 frames means a shorter rendering time, but it also means that we end up, a longer rendering time than 24 frames per second, but it also means higher quality. So the more frames per second we add, the smoother our animation will look, but it'll also require a lot more time to render. Okay, so we render this at 30 FPS, and then we set anti-aliasing to 8, so we want to make sure that this is set to 8. Again, higher numbers cause a slower rendering time. 8 is perfectly fine for our benefit. The other big one, so far we've got frames per second, and then we want to make sure anti-aliasing is set to 8. And the big one is turn off all shading that you don't need. So again, shadows, they're really, really complex. So if we're not using any ray tracing, if we're not using any shadows, subsurface scattering, or an environment map, we can get rid of all of it. Textures we probably need to keep because chances are you're using textures. And if you're using ray tracing, then keep that checked as well. But anything that we can live without, we should get rid of. So I'm going to turn off most of it. Lastly, I'm going to go to output and change where my file is going. Normally it goes to this temp directory. I don't want that. Maybe I want it on my desktop, or maybe I have a subfolder under documents. I'm going to put it on the desktop for now just so we can see it. And I'm going to hit accept. And then, now that I've got my output where it needs to be, I also need to make sure that I change the file type. So right now, the file format is PNG. PNG is an image format, as is JPEG, JPEG 2000, BMP, bitmap. All of these guys are images. And you can see that their icon is a little picture. We do not want to render our animation as an image, at least not right now. Eventually we're going to, but for today, we're just worried about rendering it as a movie file. If we render as an image, we end up creating one image per frame. So if I kept this as PNG and then I rendered my animation, I would end up with 250 image files on my computer. I don't want that. I just want to render it as a movie. Actually, the other thing, this is a good point. The other thing that I could do, since my animation ends at frame 90, I'm going to set the end to 90 so that we're not rendering more than we need to. So now I'm only going to render a 90 frame, 3-second animation. So I'm going to change PNG to H.264, which is a relatively stable movie format. So set file format to H.264. And now we should be ready to go. Codec is H.264, that's good. Output. Well, I guess we can either do... Actually, we want H.264 here. I'm sorry. Depending on what your computer is, you may want to change this. On the Macs, we're going to go with, I'll keep it in mind as H.264 for now, but on the Macs, we may want MOV, which is a QuickTime movie. In fact, this is probably better for you guys. So I can't do it right now because I'm on a PC at home, but for you guys, MOV, QuickTime, is what I believe it's called on the Mac, is what we would want to use. And then make sure that our codec is set to H.264. This guy right here. And that'll show up if you pick QuickTime as well. So even if we pick QuickTime, you still want to make sure that the codec is H.264. All right, so let's see if it worked. I'm going to render my animation. It's going to step us through, give us a brief preview while the animation renders, and once it's done, we should see this file show up on my desktop. So we'll let this go through the scaling next. And we should be good. All right, so let's see if it's there. And here we are. Our beautiful 3-second animation. So in class, you guys are going to be applying these techniques to your lighthouses and coastline. We're going to animate the coastline scene. The only other thing that I want to show you guys is how we can extrapolate movement. So let's say I really like how this animation, how the rotation part of this animation works. So right here, this section. And let's say I want my cube to rotate all the time. One thing that's really handy about Blender is that the graph editor has something called an extrapolation mode. So graph editor extrapolation. And the way that that works is that for any of the curves in the graph that show us that there's movement happening, we can create an extrapolation. Basically, it's just going to continue our movement in a particular direction. So I'm going to go to my graph editor, and under Channel in my graph editor, I'm going to go to Extrapolation Mode, and I can choose constant, linear, or cyclic. So constant is what we have right now. Constant means, I'm going to check my rotation here. Constant means that it'll do its motion, and then the curve will level off. So we can see location, y-axis, this green guy. So this guy does its movement and then levels off because the animation's done. However, if I take a look at my rotation lines, I want to actually make these guys continue forever. So I'm going to change my extrapolation to linear. And now it changes so that the curve always goes. See that there? So it makes it so that the curve is extrapolated and my motion is going to be constant. So that can be really handy if we want to only do part of a rotation and then we want to extend it. You guys are going to be doing this with your lighthouses. When you make the lighthouse light spin, all you have to do is make it spin a little bit, like maybe a quarter of the way, and then add an extrapolation mode to be able to make it continue. So Shift-E is our shortcut for extrapolation mode. And I'll upload the PowerPoint that shows you guys what the 3 different types are, but there's constant, linear, and cyclic. So let's go back to the beginning and see how this changes our animation. Now our cube spins the entire time because we added a linear extrapolation that pulls it out. If we want a motion to repeat itself, we would use cyclic. So let's take a look at our location. Our Y location only changes for a brief moment, but let's say I wanted the cube to continue to slide from one spot to the other, one spot to the other, over and over and over again. I could use Shift-E and do a cyclic extrapolation, which is going to make the cube always bounce from here to here. Let's check it out. So cycles, or a cyclic animation or extrapolation, allows me to repeat a given motion over and over and over again. So we can repeat, and we can also make our motion constant. We can, or linear rather, so that it actually continues the entire time. And that way, it saves me from having to add a lot of keyframes, right? I've only added 6 keyframes here or so. Yeah, 6 keyframes. And I'm able to get motion for the entire length of my animation. And if I made this animation longer, if I bumped it back out to 250, this would still continue for the entire duration of the animation. So there you have it. We have linear extrapolation. We know how to render our animation. The only other thing that I want to show you guys is that when I said we could render anything, or keyframe anything, I meant it. So if we look at our settings here, any of these things can be keyframed. For example, if I wanted to keyframe the color of this object, so let's say I'm at frame 2, let's say at frame 2 I want this object to be white. I can hover over this guy and press I. Oh, maybe. What am I missing? There we go. Okay. I don't know why that didn't work the first time when I pressed I, but it worked the second time. So I hover over diffuse color and I press I. Notice that it gets this little yellow ring around it. That means that there is a keyframe on this property. Now let's say that over the course of this animation, all the way up to 90 seconds, I want this to change from white to pink. All I have to do is move up to the end point, so 90 frames, and then press I again to insert a keyframe, and now you can see that I have 2 material keyframes. Let's bump back to the beginning and watch what happens. My cube gradually moves from white to pink. This is what allows us to animate anything about an object. If we can hover over it in the properties of the object, then we can keyframe it. Specular color, intensity, all this stuff. If I go back to my object properties, you can see that these guys are green because at some point in my animation, I have put keyframes on location, rotation, and scale. There's all kinds of ways for me to add keyframes to many, many different things. But we always want to make sure that we remember that the shortcut is I, and we always want to make sure that we remember these 4 steps. Start your keyframe, move to a new time, change the object, and set the new keyframe. Always remember to follow those 4 very important steps. And in class, we will work on animating your lighthouses and your cameras. Thanks for watching.